fear.
Dr. G.
Hello.
Good to be back.
Here we are.
Here we are. We're, as you said, we're kind of shooting from the hip today, a little bit. I recently posted a video on my own experience with introject and internal projection. And that's kind of led us to this conversation, which is misconceptions of the shadow.
Yes.
And certain psychodynamics, but you just said a quote off screen, off camera, and I want you to repeat it because I think it's brilliant.
It's a great biologist, E.O. Wilson, who said, "I've been blessed with brilliant enemies." It's a quote I've carried with me over the years because it's one of those things where if you can take the critique or from someone's opinion from the opposing position from your own and really ponder it and reflect on it, you can gain immensely from it. And I feel like I've tried to do that over the years rather than just sort of dig your heels in and say, no, I try to listen to it and go, okay, this is logical. This is logical. Here's where I think you might be wrong. And let's explore that. So it served me well.
Yeah, I think it's a great quote, and it's something to live by because it allows you to, one, if you are digging in, maybe identify why you're digging in and what's at play there, instead of, do I actually believe this, or is this a vessel for me to just express certain things that maybe have more to do with my own social development or my own development. But also that it's very Socratic in that you're really kind of, instead of trying to be right, you're trying to find the truth.
Yes.
I like that a lot.
It's also a great way to think about the shadow.
Yeah.
And the shadow presents itself as the enemy frequently in dream material, etc. But if you just fight it, a lot of times you won't end up anywhere except just in a stalemate or endless combat. If you think of it as, this is the enemy that I need to learn from, what can we gain? Then you are on the path to integration, I think. But the shadow, as it's what started this whole video. The shadow has gotten all kinds of wild conversations about it in in the blogosphere, etc.
Well, and we had a kind of text conversation after you saw the video I posted, and I didn't explicitly say it in that video, but I was referring to an unconscious transference. Well, a transference is unconscious. Once it becomes conscious, I would say maybe it's a projection or a conscious projection at that point. It was Jordan Peterson. I was discussing Jordan Peterson, and I see a lot of the misconceptions around. Well, first off, he was my main exposure to, or my initial exposure to depth psychology, to Jung, Freud, in the realms of analytical psychology. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings on his part in terms of shadow integration, what it actually is. And I see a lot of what you just said is loaded, but in a really great way. The conceptualization of it as being something that might present negatively and impose a lot of pressures on the ego, but isn't necessarily the enemy of the ego.
That's right.
I see that everywhere, which is,
yes, absolutely.
This is negative. This is bad. I need to avoid it. And I need to instill certain maybe rules in my life in order to kind of suppress or suppress and repress the inner the inner demon, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say are some of the bigger misconceptions out there that Peterson is proposing?
I think he talks about a lot, and specifically in terms of for men, right? He talks a lot about kind of integrating the shadow, which I don't think you can necessarily integrate the shadow itself. You can integrate contents of the unconscious, right? But a big misconception that I think he polarizes it to a certain extent. He misconstrues or misunderstands the function of it as it not necessarily being this thing, this inner dragon, right? It's more of a whatever you're doing consciously, it's the opposite of that, and whatever is unactualized that needs to be actualized is then becoming either a complex within the framework or the complex of the alter ego, the shadow. So I think that's a huge problem when you decide to polarize the psychodynamic and the structure itself as something that is strictly your inner monster, right? Or the inner dragon. I think that's very much an internal projection onto the unconscious, or at the very least a part of the unconscious. Mm-hmm. I think that's a huge issue. But he coats it. He says two things. He says you need to get more in tune with your aggressiveness and your nature. I would agree with that, to the extent where if you're already not an aggressive person, or if you're a person that needs to, as an individual, get in tune with your aggressiveness, that might be something that you should do. Yes. But then underneath that is that this aggressiveness is the shadow, is the thing that is within all human beings that makes us or gives us the capacity to be, guards at a gulag, and that's where I have the biggest issue with it, because it's not right. It isn't. It's not how. Why would it be evolutionarily adaptive for us to be born with this thing that is just dark and antisocial, right? Or born with this inner demon or dragon that just wants us to really screw up the world, so to speak.
Yeah. Right. So if you're going to bring evolution into it, which I believe Peterson does quite a bit, then you need to be very careful how you do it. And this is something that's occupied my thinking for years. Yeah. And there's a lot of potential pitfalls in bringing evolution into psychology. And one of them is to propose that some sort of contents exist due to evolution, but don't put a whole lot of thought necessarily into why it might be there. And if you're going to explain it like that, then you need to use evolutionary principles to do so. So, for example, aggressiveness. It's definitely a part of the human experience to potentially be aggressive. Why? Well, because striving for dominance gives you a reproductive advantage, particularly for males of any species. Humans are no exception. So then that means that there's logically going to be more potential for aggression and even violence in males than females. But that is not to say, it's very easy to take a statement like that and oversimplify it and say men are aggressive and women are not, which is a bunch of crap because women have very much the same evolutionary and biological drive to compete with one another for reproductive advantage too. It's just of a different character and flavor. And it's all based on the anatomy, right? It's all very straightforward from a biological standpoint. To go from that to guards at the gulag, though, is a big jump. It's a really big jump because that is not something that is that has had a lot of time in our human history. So if we're going to look at that, we need to say, okay, what might have led to something like that being manifest in this particular cultural context? And so you can't remove the cultural context from it, because that's the environment in which these things evolved in a culture of some kind. Generally speaking, we're talking foraging cultures, because that's what humans have been over the course of our existence on the planet, as foragers. So in that environment, then aggression and assertiveness and striving for dominance and even violence is rewarded with reproductive advantage, right? So that's just one of the things that's interwoven into the genome. I think it's important to not make two major problems here, to make two major mistakes. One is to what we call the naturalistic fallacy, and say, okay, well, it's just part of human nature, so therefore it must be good. No, no, that's a totally different subject, right? That's ethics. That's a whole field of philosophy. What is right and what is wrong, which has presumably some sort of objective truth to it, regardless. And if you believe that there is no objective truth, then you've got a whole host of problems, and surrounding moral relativism. We don't need to get into all that, but if that it is the case that there are, then you pursue that with philosophical argument, and go through that, rather than say, well, we have this inner nature that is potentially aggressive and violent. Okay, that is true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should act on it. It means that it has served us to this particular point in evolution.
Right.
So that's problem one. Problem two, again, is separating the act from the impulse. And it is, I think, our moral duty to look at these things with clarity and say, this is something that we can potentially light a fire inside of us if we're not careful. And again, we're back to the archetype discussion of how, if you're not careful, they can dominate your thoughts. This is no different. And only reflection and, like you say, Socratic dialogue with this stuff can really get us to where we need to go. Because again, so is the ego, right? The ego is there too for a reason. And that is to try to balance these out. Because just always acting on aggression, if there was no need to balance that out, we wouldn't have the impulse to do so. Right? So you can always look at it that way. And clearly we do. So our task as imperfect human beings, what we inherit is a number of different opposing forces within the psyche. And we have to figure out how to balance them out. That's not given to us, in a set of instructions, right? But what are your thoughts?
No, what I think is that when the psyche in general, the ego, the psyche is telic, right? There's a teleology. There's a through line, and I think once we understand that, and we understand that there is a purpose to whatever we're experiencing in terms of pressures from the unconscious, then it becomes a relationship of communication and reciprocity between inner and outer, as within, so without. And I suppose where I was at with a lot of the content with Peterson, but pop psychology in general, specifically Jungian pop psychology, which if Jung was around now, would probably look at it and just be horrified. He'd just be like, what are you talking about? What are you doing? Like, this isn't it.
Well, he was famous for saying, thank God I am young and not a Jungian.
Yeah, right.
So, and that's just with his own followers. So can you imagine what he would think of the insanity that's being spread about in his name? Like Muad'Dib across the galaxy.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Oh, not that.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I was at this place where you said it earlier while we were discussing. It was like, well, when you're not in communication with it, or you're not open to communication through your dreams, through your external action in the world, then you are very much in this. Your ego is kind of in this state of flux constantly, in between, like doing what it's doing and then not doing what it feels like, not doing what the unconscious pressures are really telling it to negotiate with.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the message that somebody like Peterson puts out there is that, and I think he really does come at it from, he imposes a Judeo-Christian ethic onto it, and he very much simultaneously makes a statement that you need to become more aggressive, but understand that, and to a certain degree, I mean, he says other stuff in regards to the shadow and expression, but then simultaneously says that human beings need to get in tune with their capacity to become really demons, right? And it's such a, I think it's such a corrosive way to look at it, because I don't think we are innately evil, right? I don't think there is, and I especially don't think that's what the shadow is. Two, I think that it's almost like this imposition of original sin in a way. It's like to say that those unconscious pressures and those impulses to act are especially the baser, right, ones, if you can qualify them as such, are part of this kind of animalistic means of being, which are inherently have been considered negative, right? So all that put together, I really do think it can be a detriment for some people to go through that experience, really seeking help, and being told that, well, the best way to help yourself is to realize how bad you could be. And I'm like, that, like, what? What do you, what? No, like, no.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I work with a lot of folks who definitely can use part of that message, right? Where their anger and their assertive, I try to use that word rather than aggressive, tendencies, they have suppressed for whatever reason over the years. During development, they're told that's bad. You know, particularly a lot of women are, they get a lot of negative feedback about being assertive because of various things. And so I have to help them unlock those things. And, you know, saying that it's recognize just how evil you can be, I'm not going to get anywhere with that, with a lot of folks that I'm talking to try to tap into those natural resources that they have, right? Because they're not inherently evil any more than a rock is inherently evil. It's just there, right? If you grab it and I smash somebody in the head with it, okay, that's evil. But that's a whole level of context that the rock doesn't, you know,
Depends on why you smash their head in with a rock.
Well, again, that's true. Exactly. And the context, you know, continues on from there. Like, well, maybe I needed to do that in order to survive or protect somebody or whatever. So, you know, and of course, if violence in itself is wrong, then our planet is really messed up. And I'm not talking about just humans, right? Because animals are very violent. Are they evil? Okay. See, so it's not that simple. But, you know, regardless, I get folks that come into my office, and part of their misery is that they feel like they've been taken advantage of. They feel like people are pushing them around, etc., and they don't know what to do with it. And so they get the anger that is naturally evoked from being pushed around, say. But let's say their whole life they've been taught that you don't get angry, that's bad. Then they're not going to be able to tap into that.
No.
And some of that anger is justified. And so I have to help them see that feeling angry does not make you bad or evil. It depends on what you do with it.
Yeah.
If you go randomly smashing people, okay, that might be evil. On the other hand, if you use it to fuel your own sense of self-preservation or putting boundaries around yourself to keep people from taking advantage of you, etc., that's good. They need that.
Yeah.
So that seems like the kernel maybe of what he's getting at. I don't know. I can't read his mind, but
Yeah.
I'm sure the message certainly seems to get garbled.
Yeah.
From that. You know?
I think that's a very kind of naturalistic and very therapeutic approach to it. What you just said, because if you or any practitioner for that matter were to sit down with a client or a patient and say, well, you deep down, there's some evil in you, and you have to figure that out. And it's just like,
They're gonna think I'm nuts.
yeah, it's like, what do you like? How I think if you weren't, I think that's a great approach, Dr. Goodwin. I think it's a message that needs to be heard, and a message that I would say that Peterson on the surface puts out, but deep down underneath that, there is some of his own shadow projections onto the world. And I think that's a huge issue. But the message that you put out in terms of somebody just getting in tune with what they need to express, what needs to be expressed, what is the unconscious presenting, what is the shadow presenting, however you want to kind of structuralize it psychodynamically, is what therapy really should be about, because it's about that person. It's not about whether or not you think that, you know, Solzhenitsyn was a brilliant author, and that, you know, all of us have the capacity to be, you know, Holocaust guards or Gulag guards, you know, I mean, or not Holocaust, Auschwitz, you know, it's something that for myself, again, being on this journey, that more and more people should really learn, like not even learn, but come at it with that framework, because I think that's a brilliant framework to have. It's like, I am not my own enemy. I'm not. The things within me that want to be expressed are trying to tell me something. Yes. And man, you need to start listening. You need to start listening, and you need to start doing, because you're going to feel a whole lot better if you do.
Oh yeah, because the folks that I just described that have that particular issue with their own anger or their own aggressive tendencies, or maybe even ambitious feelings, they get bound up, they get locked away, they get labeled as the evil and bad and the enemy, and you should just be nice and be good and all that. The problem with that is that that does not make those things disappear or go away. And instead, what it does is it just sits there and festers and resents. And sooner or later, that gets turned inwardly. It's kind of like when people get pushed around or bullied long enough, they either take it out on themselves and do this kind of stuff, right? Or they take it out on others. It might be displaced towards something that can't fight back, right? So that's maybe a study in how this stuff gets manifested when it's not dealt with. So in a sense, not dealing with it is really the thing that you shouldn't do. But again, it's easy to understand why people get locked into that frame of mind. You know, obviously there's other people who they just lash out at anything that moves, and they think that unrestricted expression of their anger is fine. I don't normally see those folks in my office. They tend to go somewhere else in life. You know, but it's just out of balance in both ways. Either way, right? I'm not dealing with it, or I'm not being constructive with it. I'm just being destructive with it. But it is just raw energy at the very kernel of it, and not inherently evil. I mean, it's kind of like a gun can be used to kill and do evil things, or it can be used to defend from attack, but it's just a gun. It's everything that goes around it. The context is what matters. So nature has given us weapons to use, because those of us that had weapons survived to pass that on, and those that didn't have any didn't make it. So maybe that's another way to look at it. The animalistic.
The animalistic. Yeah, so much of it resonates, and it needs to be spoken at the top of a mountain. Just becoming your own ally, not necessarily having to burn off the dead wood or the parts of you that are useless. And
how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, how do you do that? Right?
How do you tell me? I mean, I get, and this is another thing, is particularly with anger.
Yeah.
Because it's so often seen as bad. I get folks that come in, men and women both, who over the years, if it's their anger is is coming out too much, right? They get rage, for whatever, and or they're the other type of person that suppresses their own feelings of anger and rage, and it turns inwardly, and it turns into all sorts of psychosomatic issues and all this kind of stuff. And they come into the office, and I think they have a fantasy that I am somehow going to medicate and or therapize their anger away. And once I usually am on the lookout for that belief that's hiding in there under the surface. And then once I uncover it, we have to have a conversation. And the conversation is, it doesn't work that way. It's there. In fact, it's yours, and you have a right to it, damn it. So, and here's why I think that's the case. And all that sort of thing, For the folks that blast, anger out indiscriminately, I want to get at what is causing that. What are the things that are triggering you to go into 5-alarm defense mode and overexpress? So these are oftentimes folks with bipolar disorder, maybe post-traumatic stress disorder. I saw this a lot in the military. And most of them were men, and they had a terrible time with it because they would, of course, overreact to things, and then they would feel horrible about it. And then they would feel guilty, and they'd be beating themselves, and that rage would be turning inwardly again. And they'd end up in this endless cycle. And I'm like, what is the anger trying to do? Let's unlock that. It's there, like you said, the telos of that. It is there to defend against attack, whether that's physical attack or could be reputation attack, right? That's just as serious. Anyone who's ever been bullied in, school, or, like a whole crowd of people looking at you and laughing at you, that evokes rage. And the reason is because your reputation is under attack. You might think, well, reputation, who cares about that? Homo sapiens cares about that, because those that are low on the reputation totem pole in the world of Homo sapiens don't reproduce as well. So there's a very strong biological imperative that says you need to be concerned about this and you need to defend it. So but that in and of itself is not evil.
Yeah.
It's just that it comes out in such a intensity. It's raw intensity, raw nature. If it's not blended or integrated with the ego, it wreaks havoc.
Yeah.
And does that mean that you are potentially a demon? That's going a little far.
Yeah.
That's going a little far. It's just an instinct. It's a reflex.
Yeah.
That is geared towards helping us survive, helping us potentially pass those genes on. I mean, that's there. It's just there. It's every animal has that.
Yeah.
Plants have it, They just don't do battle with each other except in, Middle Earth.
Well, you never know.
But you never know. That's true.
Never know.
Chemical warfare going on.
Right.
Nobody knows about it.
Right. Happening. Right. Oh,
Yeah.
Don't even get me started on that movie. Don't even get me started on that movie.
Yeah, that's a weird one.
Well, you bring up a lot because it is telic, but I think I think with somebody like Peterson, I think there's and for those that follow it, and there is this kind of like neurosis, right? That it's almost as if, and I think this is where like the Freudian idea of the superego comes in, which is you have these external ideas that really create a polarity in the individual, and then the unconscious pressures that are coming up really become morphed into they become the scapegoat or the rationalized as the negative side of that polarity, when in actuality they are that telic force that are just like, no, stop what you're doing. Like, you need to express this, and it needs to be expressed thoroughly, and it doesn't mean it has to be expressed like almost like the shotgun of rage or anger. It can be negotiated with. And I think it really does involve a lot of social relationships for people. It's like, why suffer and bear this burden of a lack of actualization? Well, because if you're being told that this burden and lack of actualization is a good thing, or is in commune with what the other ideals external to you are suggesting, then you're in for a hell of a neurotic experience. And that's where I was at personally.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. The war between the instinct and culture.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of confusion in this
Yeah.
group of ideas because, okay, so you mentioned Freud. And so we're going to talk about Freud for a second because I think he was wrong. I think he was onto something, but he didn't quite get it. So the way he frames it, of course, is id versus superego, and the ego's caught in the middle of this. With the idea that the id is what comes from the biology and the superego is what comes from culture. And these two things apparently exist in these separate spheres that are unrelated to each other, and they just act on the ego. But that's a bunch of baloney because culture itself comes from our biology.
Right.
And culture feeds into the biology, and everything's interrelated at multiple levels, our systems thinking, right? So we know that coming from the way we come at things in general. So we know it's much more complex. In a sense, then, every culture is a type of experiment which will then interact with our human nature in some way. And sometimes it clicks, and sometimes it doesn't click. And sometimes when cultures are in rapid transition, you get a whole lot more problems because the culture hasn't been able to catch up with whatever's going on to cause the changes, see? And so then the psyche, this is what Jung called the spirit of the depths, takes a while to play out. Okay, so I think the way Jung looked at it made more sense to me when I first started reading it, because he talks about how it's not quite so simple as that. In fact, a lot of the things that we might attribute to the superego, like guilt and shame, and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, are already in the psyche. And of course they must be, or else, you wouldn't have things like feelings of shame or guilt at all, really. Where is that coming from?
Yeah.
You can see this in dogs, right? And they do something they know they're not supposed to do, and you come up and you shake your finger at them, and they're like, right? And it sure looks like shame to me, But that's a thing that you only see in social animals.
Yeah.
And humans, of course, extremely social animals. And I go through this conversation with a lot of my patients too. Like, we've talked about anger. Let's talk about guilt for a minute and shame. Why do they exist at all? What do you think?
Well, I think that there's a difference between, like at IPSA, we talk about it as a moral complex, right? And that it encompasses a lot of learned behavior from your parents, from society, from culture in general. I think if culture is taken too far in a certain direction and then imposed downwards, i.e. a top-down approach, then, and not a kind of systems approach, that's when you see a surplus of energy just from the unconscious, like, no. And that's when you, a lot of shadow pressure, you could call it. That's one thing. The second thing there is that I do feel like the way that Jung conceptualized it and how we kind of conceptualize it now in terms of the system is that the instincts, that framework, that kind of, there is a telic, there is value there is care, there is a drive towards a more socialized I, me. Most definitely, that is a part of how we evolved. I think it's when, again, if there's if there are polar opposites present in the culture, and when those are imposed on the individual, that's when you start getting, and those are over identified with, and then internally projected into the psyche. That's when you're like, that's when things get bad. I think a healthy culture is a culture that is exactly what you just said, is more of a continuous flow instead of a complete walled up block and said, this is it, and this is all that it will ever be. And now you got me on this, because I think cultures that are taken too far in certain directions in terms of instincts, because you can look at certain ideologies, religions, cultural foundations, what have you. And I when I look at them now, I say, what instinct is at play here, or instincts are at play here? And if there's one in particular that's taken too far in a certain direction, that's when there's a polarity. That's when there's a neurosis, and it's stagnant, and it's heavily, it's stagnant. It's impoverished, but it's also heavily imposed on the people that are living in it.
Yeah, yeah. So I think you're right. That the instincts are there, and then a culture will selectively amplify some and inhibit others, and sometimes it goes too far in that, and that's where the experimentation, I think, the analogy is what I was trying to say, is that a culture will be variably successful on those axes, you know. I think a good example is something that Jared Diamond talks about in Guns, Germs, and Steel. The two tribes known as the Maui and the Maoriori. Probably not pronouncing those right, but stay with me for a second. They were genetically related tribes in the Southeast Ocean, areas, and the Maui tribe was more on the mainland, and the Maoriori was an island culture. Okay. Both derived from a common ancestor around 500 years prior to the time that these were studied in the early 20th century, I think late 19th century possibly, in that region of time. And but the cultures were extremely different. So the mainland tribe, the Maori, which still exist, they were very warlike. They had an agricultural society. There was constant fighting over resources. So they had a very warlike ethos. The men needed to be strong and masculine and not show weakness and all that sort of thing. The Maoriori, on the other hand, were in an island area with very low in resources, and they could not afford to be fighting each other because they were so scarce. So they developed their own cultural complexes about how we should all get along together. We should only resolve conflict peacefully. They even castrated a certain number of infant males that tells you something right there, to reduce the amount of conflict and chaos and mayhem, right? In a very direct and yet effective manner. Now, once these two tribes were separated from each other by about 500 years. And once the Maui came to discover the Maoriori, what do you think happened?
Oh,
they got absolutely wrecked by the warlike tribe. So what all this stuff tells me, there's nothing genetically different about either of these groups. There's not one group that's just naturally more aggressive than the other group. It's the interaction of the instincts with the culture that is created. They merge together over time to create a way of life that helps each one survive. One had to be warlike, because if they weren't like that, they would get clobbered, like the Maoriori did, unfortunately for them. And it was only the separation by geography that kept this from spreading. In other words, they would have been just as warlike, But because they had been isolated and they had their own set of problems there, they found a way to solve it. Which one of these groups is right or wrong?
Right.
On a certain level, nature doesn't care about that. Nature is concerned about who's left, not who's right.
Right.
You're the only ones left, so guess who wins? You get to write the history books.
Right.
So that's harsh, but that's how it is, right? That's the way Jung put it, is nature doesn't give a damn about man.
Right.
But the way he was talking about it was in reference to some parts of the unconscious, which are like, survive is your imperative. Right. And that's it. All right. So now let's get back to my earlier question, which was guilt and shame. What is up with those? Those exist in social animals because if we don't have them, we don't cooperate with each other because we don't give a crap about what anybody tells us to do. Right. So I think we talked about that before. Tigers, right? They don't care. Right. Bears, they roam the woods and they don't give a crap about what anybody says. Okay, but they're not social animals. They're solitary. Right. But we don't operate that way. So in order to motivate that behavior, Mother Nature has instilled in all of us the potential for feelings of guilt and shame. So it is triggered by the surrounding culture, but it only works because we're already primed for it. Nature says you're going to be a social animal. You're going to survive via cooperative efforts of others. And I'm going to make sure you care about that by making you feel bad if everyone looks at you and says you're wrong. Now, that means that we are all vulnerable to, like you said, those rigid structures. That's how they can potentially perpetuate on and on and on for generations, because it's effective. It works. You know, all of us, no matter how much we might get on Facebook and shout about how we don't care about what anybody else thinks, it's a bunch of bull crap. Yes, you do.
You
don't
do.
give me that junk. Yeah. You sure as hell do.
Yeah, you wouldn't be saying it if you didn't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why would I say that if I didn't really care? I wouldn't even bother. I wouldn't even be on Facebook.
Exactly.
Or any other
social media. Yeah, it's social media.
It is social media. Yeah.
I know.
So it's the great irony is people get on social media to tell everyone how antisocial they are.
Yeah.
I'm not buying it. Sorry.
You see those shows, the antisocial social club?
Yeah. Yeah. And they people that love to wear their antisocial as kind of a badge of honor, right? Which doesn't make any sense at all. So those things, I think, are what Jung was getting at when he said that conscience is coming from the same source as these things that we so-called label as evil. It's all in there. It's all in there. And, you know, if you watch children, toddlers, as they develop, you can see the seeds of good and evil in them. And it's sometimes at the same time. It's really interesting when you look at it this way, because small children, they're very sweet and they're caring and they're very loving, and they'll also clobber you if you steal their toy and, you know, stuff like that. Sometimes within minutes of each other, you know, and it's neither evil nor good really at that age when they're 2, because they're too little for those labels to make much sense. But you can see where it's headed, where it's going, and how they can develop into things we might call that later. So it's about what's nurtured, what is not nurtured, what is rigidly imposed or not.
And what complexes are at play in terms of action? Like, are you acting through the lens of something that is maladaptive? Like, are you acting through a lens that is something that is adaptive and going to build new associations? See, I don't even look at it as positive, negative. Is it life affirming? Like, is it a continuation? Does it propagate growth, not only within yourself, but with the world around you? Or is it kind of receding and potentially, you know, when I say self-harming, I mean like almost as if the body decides not to fight for itself anymore, right? Is it catabolic, or is it, you know, the mitochondria aren't doing their job, so to speak, you know? But I think you bring a good point with all of it, because what comes to my mind is like, okay, the social structures that we put in place around and based off of what we are instinctually. I think the issue then becomes when we push those to the limit so far that they are separate, or we separate them from our biology to the degree that it becomes this idealized grasp on an ideology, a belief that is so whole, like this. I love conversations like this, and it always gets to this, because again, it is a system. But whenever I have conversations about this with people, it's like, you know, we're now getting to the core of not only what could be potentially happening in terms of an individual's relationship with their own unconscious, but then you see it reflected in the culture, because those two things are so intimately interlinked, right? And you can't avoid it. You can't avoid that conversation. And now we live in a culture that is, I would argue, very positivistic, tends to avoid biological realities, and might still identify the unconscious or subconscious as this kind of animalistic, baser id. But my answer to that would be, well, we evolved. as human beings, and I'm assuming our instincts evolved as well.
Sure.
And like we're talking about now,
Yeah.
care is right there. Care is innate. We feel guilty when we do something that breaks a social agreement because it works.
Yeah.
It works.
Mm-hmm. Because if we had a whole society of people that felt no guilt or shame about anything, we wouldn't have a society at all. So those things, they of course can be overdone, but having none is not the answer either.
Yeah.
See, so it's the golden path, right?
Yeah.
And the Maui and the Maori example is illustrated on another level, and that is that those social mores and value systems that were perpetuated orally through instruction or whatever, they were based on things that culture found to work given the environment they were in. So you have a few generations, quite a few generations probably, of this agricultural lifestyle where there's a lot of concentration of food and resources, and they're under intense conflict from other people that want that stuff, right? And then let's not even get into the fact that in that kind of setting, you oftentimes have raids where they kill all the men and take all the women, right? So it's men fighting over women, right? So that's something you see in the animal kingdom as well, because we're part of the animal kingdom. We're not exempt from that sort of stuff. And then the Maori, right, which didn't do a lot of that stuff. But that was because they crafted their culture around their setting.
Yeah.
So the culture is a response to a set of environmental variables. When they change radically, the culture takes some time to catch up with those changes. So if you look at the 20th century and you ask yourself, what has changed over the 20th century? Oh, I don't know, everything.
Yeah.
Everything has changed. No wonder there's all of this cultural chaos going on. And, people look back at the 50s as like some kind of gilded age. And before that, everything was exactly the same up until, the hippies. They're fooling themselves. We've been in massive flux for centuries because we can't keep up pace with all these changes. So that affects the psyche of every individual. If you're grown up in the Western world, you can't escape all of this stuff, and it all plays into how the shadow behaves at the individual level. So that's what we're up against, that kind of complexity. And I just think, it's very easy to oversimplify that, which is probably something that you've seen done in the psychology world. And I just shake my head when I see that. I'm like,
well, yeah,
that easy.
You think about okay, we came from these hunter-gatherer, we were foragers in small bands, and yes, at a certain point it might have been very much this kind of egalitarian, right, group, but it was very small. And the reason why we weren't necessarily warring with one another might be because we were warring with the external environment so much that we had to concentrate on just merely surviving.
Well, and also a part of it is population density.
Right.
If you're in a foraging tribe, now, I mean, let's not fool ourselves. They engaged in warfare, and they still do. Chimpanzees engage in warfare. Gorillas engage in warfare. So that's all in there, right? And then we can talk about the origin of that one of these days. But it's less common and less needed if you can just go over there and avoid these guys over here.
Yeah.
So you don't need to really worry about that. But then when you start to look at different environments, like say the Great Plains of North America, and some of the Native American tribes there, very warlike, very, very tough, strong warrior ethos, because they needed to do that because there were tribes fighting all the time. So I don't have much patience for the taking foraging tribes and fetishizing them and exoticizing them, or thinking of them as this sort of paradisical state. They still had war, they still had murder, they still had rape and all that stuff. They had a different set of problems that we had. arguably they had less problems. We've just got so much more complexity going on here.
Yeah.
And the amount, even though the average individual person might be, like, and Steven Pinker has talked a lot about this stuff about, well, we got less violence percentage wise, but even that is, there's certain, criticisms against that out there. It's terms of statistics that he uses to justify that we're better off now. In some of his writings, he says things like that. We're better off in our current society. I'm a little skeptical of that. But we might be very unlikely to get killed by a member of another army, from some other country, right? But then we have other weird problems, like the fact that the most likely person to murder you is you. If you're dead and they say got shot by a gun, you're the most likely person who have done it, because our suicide rates are high.
Yeah.
And they keep going up. So what's up with that?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. We're not getting shot at by other people. We're just shooting ourselves because we're so miserable. That's great.
Yeah. Hey, yeah, you're not going to kill me, but I'm going to
score.
I'm going to go kill myself. Oh, that's terrible. Terrible. No, but all humor. I mean, I guess moments like this, you kind of have to be humorous about it. But at the same time, I think it gets back to what we're kind of the underlying, the fabric of this conversation, which is a true and honest and authentic and healthy approach to your unconscious, and that needing to be a priority, not only for individuals in therapy, but everyone, right? Everyone. Now, I was going to ask you something in terms of your clinical experience, and this is something that I've found. Usually, that when there is an increase in shadow pressure, or an increase in pressure from the unconscious, at IPSA we call it the alter ego, right? And things coming forward, whether they be in dreams or arousal states, so anxiety, things that are experiences that are very tense. Typically, what I found personally, and anecdotal to me, but also in people that I've spoken with, is that the increase in pressure, the imagery in dreams, right, tends to increase as well. And the unconscious will utilize very dramatic, I would say hypersymbolic imagery in order to convey the need, right? So I'll give you, for instance, I've had hypnagogic states where there have been, I've been partially awake and seen the face of, I believe it's the Japanese Oni, in my room, right? And it was this very, very anxiety-driven state. It got me out of my bed to the extent where it was almost like a night terror. And this was a while ago. And understanding where I was at psychically there, right, where my psyche was and how well adaptive I was, it was very much a sign that there was increased pressure for me to become more well adapted in my current environment, in my current situation.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, to what degree, for you clinically, have you experienced, or talking to people that have experienced?
Yeah. Well, like we've talked about before, dreams don't emerge just for the heck of it. They emerge for a focused purpose, which is to aid in adaptation. Do they always have the whole picture? Are they always perfect? No, of course not. But they often incorporate more than is present within the ego. And they depict your current situation from kind of a bird's eye view, where you, the dreamer, are immersed in the narrative that the rest of the psyche constructs the environment around you. It's very interesting, and the more you think about it, the weirder it gets, because you're like, well, how does that really work anyway? Like, if you think of yourself only as the ego, and this is why you need to be able to differentiate between ego and non-ego. The psyche encompasses both. If you can't do that, then dream narratives don't make much sense. Like how it is, where are they coming from? Which is also, I think, why so many cultures around the world have identified that dream content comes from outside, from the divine realm, from the spirit world. For our purposes, it comes from the unconscious, which might as well be the spirit world, because it's not ego. I don't construct the narrative of the dream. I don't put together the symbolism and arrange it as such and say, your life is as if this is happening. Something else in the psyche does that. So that something else, we can call it the unconscious. In my book, I call it the invisible storyteller, but you can call it God. You can call it whatever you want to.
Yep.
It's a thing that is non-ego, but is intensely psychological and psychic in terms of containing psyche. And it puts together this narrative that says, you've got this demonic figure. You've got this anxiety. There's something going on in your life that's like that. And that is where you are. It doesn't say you need to figure it out. I don't think that's necessarily part of it. It may, however, give you, it may have, on the other hand, it may produce characters that, if you do listen to them, can lead you where you need to go. So that's where kind of intuitions and we've talked about adaptive reflexive responses and so forth. Deity-like figures that are benevolent. You know, Odin shows up and tells me you need to do this. I'm probably going to do it because it's probably a good idea, right? Or God, or Jesus, or any sort of mythical character that's seen culturally as benevolent and on our side. So what's going on then is it's an attempt at adaptation to your current situation by depicting the situation that you're in symbolic terms and saying it's just like this. So definitely, it's a long answer to your question, but yes, definitely I do see that as well. I see that when they present situations. Oftentimes they'll present a situation and the behavior of the dreamer tells me what's going on. Because I think dream narratives are just like waking life in that you can choose to do something else if you want, but they typically don't. So if a person says they have a dream, say about they want to go on a walk into this beautiful nature reserve, but they're waiting around for the guide, and they keep having dreams like that. I'll look at them and I go, why are you waiting for the guide?
Right.
Why not go up there yourself? Oh, I never thought of that. They'll stop having the dream. Because that problem has figured the ego figured out what it needed to do to contribute to the situation to get them out of that. So that's where the ego part comes from. But the other part is seeing the bigger picture to begin with and then putting you in it. So that's the thing that I think is so fascinating about this. And all of that's in the shadow, technically, because it's not ego. So, but shadow is typically labeled is more focused than that. It's not just the entire unconscious. It's typically looking at characters or impulses. They're typically personified that are viewed in a negative manner, or at least in opposition to what the ego is doing. And it is, like you said, a counterbalance. It's part of the homeostatic mechanisms of the psyche, what I call the immune system of the psyche, that says, like a character can show up that you haven't met for 20 years, like you haven't talked to this person in 20 years. Maybe they even died. If that happens in a dream, or particularly if it's a recurrent dream, I'm going to ask myself, what is that piece of this person's life? Why does it need to be personified as this other person, and why are they showing up now? I will typically go into that thinking the psyche is trying to tell the ego and reintroduce it to something that it lost.
Yeah.
And so that person, if they come at them like a demon, if they're clothed in the demonic imagery, that tells me partly what the energy behind that is, and it also tells me partly of how the ego is perceiving it.
Yeah.
Because lucid dreamers have taught us that if a demonic figure approaches you and you approach it with positive greeting, it transforms right in front of their eyes into something more benign. It's like ridiculous, like Harry Potter, and then suddenly it's not scary anymore. It doesn't need to be.
Mm.
Yeah. I think I just gave you like 17 paragraphs to your question, and I don't know if I even answered your question.
I think, well, I think the response from the unconscious in terms of the imagery presenting is it's looking for and sometimes it can be paradoxical. Like it can very much be something that you would consider negative, but you're being presented a question and not an answer. And yes. I think that's really relevant in terms of how the shadow presents, how the unconscious presents.
I think you can say that in strict Jungian terminology, then the self would be the entity within the psyche that constructs the narrative. And because the self is the larger autonomous center of the psyche that constructs the dream narratives, both while you're dreaming and while you're awake, because it's going on all the time in a continuous fashion. As Jung said, the consciousness makes so much noise during the waking hours that you don't hear it. But it's like we're dreaming all the time, he says. But, when we're in the REM state or a dreaming state, sometimes it's not REM, but usually it is. But if you're in that state, you're walled off from the external world.
Mm.
So the environment of the dream is entirely internally generated. And the self, I think, is the one that constructs it and says, hey, ego, you're in a situation like this. What are you going to do next? And then the ego responds. And if the ego responds in a way that's not very productive, then the next night the self is going to say, well, that didn't work. Guess what? You're back there, pal. Now what?
Mm. Well, I think it will also, at that point, the genome's at work. The genome is like, you are not doing everything you could be doing, right?
Right. Well, and the self is the product of the genome.
Right.
Yeah. So ultimately, yes, absolutely. But that's an important piece of info, because rather than the self being this abstract entity that's postulated by clinicians, it has to be coming from the genome. The genome constructs it. How else is it going to happen, right? So that means that if we understand the genome and how the genome creates psyche, there's a metaphysical thing in there that I'm glossing over. Mind-body problem. Let's shelve that for a minute. I don't really mean create, but you know what I mean. But that there's a connection between the genome and how the psyche behaves. The self becomes a part of that blend of activities. So the genome does its thing, and the self emerges. That's a better way to put it. During the development of the person's life, I think probably quite early on, I think the self comes first, emerges first, and the ego emerges later, quite a bit later in development, probably a few years before you have what you could really identify as an ego in a child.
Right. That developmental little I, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm not just reacting and responding.
Right. Yeah.
Based on my species history, which is what you get mostly early on.
Mm-hmm.
And not only my species, my species history right on up to my parents.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, it doesn't stop at the parents. It keeps going back to the beginnings of all life on Earth.
Right.
That should be dizzying. Most people don't think of it that way, but that's exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
But then as they live and, sweat and toil under the sun, they develop their little I.
Yeah.
And so that carries on from there. And then you get a lot of stuff, especially in early adolescence, that can lead to or correlate with the emergence of these other characters, these shadow, and then, anima and animus show up later and all that sort of stuff. Right. But they all have their roots in the genome.
I like to use certain examples because it might be helpful. I mean, like you have a small child, for instance, and this is, let's say 4 or 5, really starting or at the initial stages of developing that kind of sense of self, right? The sense of identity, being told in a certain situation not to scream, right? And then taking that in, and potentially it's coming from a parental figure or a family authority or whatever it is, taking that in and it becoming a complex and association and then not screaming when screaming's necessary, that becomes further repressed and then or suppressed and then repressed. And then later on in life, you'll have that kind of shadow presentation of, well, no, there's a need for it. There's a need for expression of it, but it's not happening.
Yes, right. So the differences between the Maori and the Maoriori show us just how radically different a culture can develop and all the individuals within it based on the certain circumstances. So there's a massive variation. I don't think it's infinite, but there is a massive variation in terms of survival styles that can emerge from a species like Homo sapiens that has such complexity. And that applies, though, to each individual, right?
Yeah.
And so in a society where there's massive change, you get a whole lot more of this friction because the old social structures that worked don't necessarily work anymore because technology has changed, social dynamics have changed, et cetera. Like one of the big things that you see in evolutionary psychology is the recognition that the balance between males and females in a given culture dramatically influences the sexual mores of that culture. So if there's lots and lots of females around because the men are all killed off in a war, for example, sexual mores get relaxed significantly because there's a whole lot more females to go around for the few males. So in that situation, there's more sexual activity, a whole lot less concern about proper conduct and so forth and so on. In the opposite situation, you get a whole lot more focus on who's sleeping with who, and then this is right and this is wrong and all that kind of stuff, because there's not enough females to go around for whatever reason that might be. And you can see this pattern seen cross-culturally, So what that means is that the cultural mores that then imposed on the individual person who was, imposed is the wrong word, but taught to, I don't want to be overly negative about culture because we kind of need it. But you get where I'm going with this is that those might be outdated.
Right.
So the individual, of course, responds to the current environment. So this is why when you have large changes in culture, all of a sudden you get all this intergenerational conflict.
Yeah.
You see tons of it now. Tons of it. It's been going on for a long time. In my own life, I saw all of the upheaval. I grew up in the 70s, and I didn't know what was going on, but there was an awful lot of intergenerational conflict. There was, hey, let's throw out all the rules of marriage and man and woman, and let's just throw all that stuff out the window. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that was probably a response to dramatically changing conditions, probably related to World War II. Who knows what? A very complex picture, but now those behaviors, those impulses, right, were seen by the older generation as completely bonkers, and they don't get it. Now, does that mean that the younger generation's way of doing things is right and the old one is wrong? Probably some mixture of the two. So there's probably some middle point in there where it's like, okay, you probably don't need to go quite that far to the extreme.
Right.
But that's where you get this pendulum business going back and forth. Yeah. We talk about, this pendulum swinging back and forth. There's stuff that goes on now that is way more conservative than I remember growing up. And yet, to hear conservatives talk about it, to get political for 5 seconds, everything's been going down the tube since 1950, And it's like, no, it's not like that. It's not like there's been a lot of back and forth and bouncing back and forth. And we can't seem to find something that's stable.
I think it's like you brought up the two examples of like the populace being more predominantly female and then male. I think it's also like, what does the genome require, right? And in considering that, it's just like, okay, do we need to lax unconsciously? Do we need to become more lax potentially in terms of our sexual expression because we do need to repopulate, right? Or is it that because there is less females in the populace that we need to become more stringent because it could potentially, I think the ebbs and flows of it are very unique, and yes, that pendulum swinging back and forth, it's very unique to look at. But then if you look at it from a not only this is the wavelength in which culture kind of breathes, but also genomically, what is happening to the entirety of the populace. I think
responses didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just thinking that the responses the genome has are way more complex than we tend to think of it. We tend to think of it as a sort of mechanical, knee-jerk type of thing, and it's very sophisticated. Nothing could be further from the truth, I think. All you have to do is look at the animal kingdom for that, to see that. Like coyotes, for example, if the coyote population drops in a particular area, coyotes will now suddenly start having more pups. I don't know how they know that they need to do this, but they just do. So there's something's going on. They're picking up something in the environment. I don't know how they know how many coyotes there are 100 miles away from them, or some kind of thing that they're picking up on. I'm sure there's some mechanism, but I'm not sure that anyone's sorted that out yet. Nevertheless, if coyotes do that sort of thing, I bet you humans do, probably to the nth degree. And so, like, what you're talking about, the populations of males and females, right? Now let's be real here for a second, okay? A single male can impregnate 99 women in one, in a short period of time, whereas a single female can only have one child at a time. So then that means the rules are different if there's more females or more males in terms of sexual, relations. So if their males are depleted, it makes perfect sense for the sexual mores and for everyone to just say, well, who cares? Because now we've got a bunch of females and a few males.
Yeah.
Then it's party time for the males in order to counterbalance that, Yeah, hurrah. Yeah. But on the other end of that, right? So say females are depleted. Okay, that's a seriously dangerous position because of the rate limiting step with the females. And so now the reason why the mores shift is because only the best men are the ones that are going to get to win the lottery and reproduce. And so the competition becomes much more ferocious, and women get to run the show and say, only the top earners, the biggest guys, the strongest, the most athletic, the most gorgeous are the ones that are going to get to go. So that shifts in that direction. So it's still competition. It's still about reproduction, but each gender has its own flavor of that and how it manifests. And like you said, somehow the genome it's all in there. Yeah. And this is why the idea of a collective unconscious makes a lot of sense, because these are things that manifest on a culture-wide scale in response to culture-wide challenges and environmental changes. Yeah. Deep stuff.
It is. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Yeah.
You had a thought there that I kind of bowled over you.
I'm thinking about like morphic resonance, Rupert Sheldrake's stuff in terms of species-specific communication across continents, right? And stuff like that. But no, I think, it's it's deep stuff. It's deep stuff. Yeah. It really, again, it goes back to the how the interaction with your own personal psyche and where you're at in terms of your own, really, I think that your own development, how that really can be expressed in the environment, and how the cultural environment, how is that running through you? And I mean, having the ability to just be able to navigate that, and having the ego strength to kind of be able to navigate
ego
that.
Strength
is
critical.
So important. It's so important.
Absolutely. That's where you start with any therapy. You've got to help develop that first. Yeah. So critical, because otherwise you're going to get cast around like you're, lost at sea. Because as we've been discussing, stuff that comes from the unconscious, it's not like Freud put it. It's not like culture way over here, id way over there. Never the twain shall they communicate. So whatever is manifesting unconsciously could very well be something that is culture-wide, or even global-wide. Who knows? Nobody's even looked at that, as far as I'm aware. of how species might respond to global changes in things like global environments. I don't know. And you could look at it from the point of view of morphic resonance. Those that are very skeptical of that sort of stuff, I think, have other avenues they can look at it. There are lines of communication there that we haven't quite explored. And I don't think that Sheldrake necessarily argues against that.
Yeah.
I'm not as familiar with his work, but and there is metaphysical positions that would make it work quite well, like panpsychism and so forth. But all that aside, whatever it is that you're experiencing, you individually is not just about you.
Yeah.
That's, I guess, the bottom line. It is, but it is also more than that too. There could be things emerging that are more to do with culture-wide things. So if you wonder, if you ever wonder, like, why is this particular generation so obsessed with rebelling against the man? Part of that might be the recognition that the younger generation sees things are different now, and the old ways of doing things might not always work. The problem, though, is always the black and white response. It's all or nothing responses, right? It's not nuanced. It's
right.
It's like the immune system. The first lines of the immune system are very simple. They're quick. They're primitive. They're easy. Inflammation. Get a fever. It doesn't matter what's attacking you. Just do that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
51% of the time it helps. Okay, so that's all you need to perpetuate. But later on, if you stay with it, you'll develop the T cell and the B cell immune system that is developing magic bullets for the one particular thing. That's why vaccines work. Vaccines work. People, don't get me started. But you see what I'm saying? The analogy is there, right? So the response, it might be, it's natural, it's a reflex, it's a response to what's going on, but it's oftentimes going to be primitive, it's going to be clumsy or unsophisticated. That's where the ego has to come in and do its work and say, let's craft this raw material. Let's not pretend it like it's not there. Let's not therapize it away. You can't do either of those anyway. Rather, this impulse, whatever it might be, how do I apply it to my situation and make it relevant to me so that I can express myself, and also I can be in balance with myself, but I'm also adjusted to my outside society.
Yeah.
Those are two very important things to focus on, because I think a lot of times, because we've got this hyper individualistic culture, it's all about you, right? Me, just me being the best me, and I'm self-actualized and all that kind of stuff. Like, okay, that's great, Mr. Self-actualized, but you also live in a culture that you need to get along with people. We all can't just be gurus at the top of the mountain, or hermits out in the wilderness. As much as that would be great, I guess.
I would argue it isn't. I think that's another layer of all this, which is that it's like, man, you want to develop yourself, and you want to kind of it is an engagement with the environment. It's not just an engagement with what the internal pressures are pressures for external engagement.
Yes.
Outward. And it's usually not to isolate yourself and pull yourself away. I would say almost 99.9% of the time it isn't. It is, yes, you come to those realizations, and then you go off into the world and you really engage with it properly. But then to simultaneously kind of qualify and polarize, it can be highly neurotic, right? And through us having this conversation, I mentioned Peterson. He uses this analogy, burning off the dead wood. But I think you said an ego without ego strength can be kind of, you're caught in that ocean, right? I think a better analogy would be to build your ship, right? I mean, Steve Richards at IPSA says, test your metal, go out into the world and test your metal, layer upon layer, test your metal. I think I like that. That's so much
alchemy.
Right. Exactly. It's more alchemical, and it's less of this kind of CBT approach to saying, just get rid of the stuff that you don't like and stop thinking about it and follow these rules, and then life will be okay.
Oh, wouldn't that be great if that worked?
Make a list.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and right. Okay. So the problem with that approach is very commonly CBT is great, very, very effective in most cases, but it's not a panacea. It doesn't work for everything. And what I run into frequently is, well, I don't know about frequently, but in certain cases, I run into this brick wall, which is, okay, I know that how I feel is irrational. Now what? I still feel it. Now what? What am I supposed to do? And there's not a whole lot more you can do with that if all you do is obsess about you have an irrational cognition,
Right.
And that's, now granted, I'm not being entirely fair to CBT because that's garbage CBT, but if I didn't see so much of it out there, I wouldn't get to complain so much, and unfortunately, high quality CBT is a very different animal than just, rote cookbook CBT. But that's a whole other conversation, But I do love to pick on CBT, mainly because a lot of those CBT gurus out there, they pretend like theirs is the only evidence-based.
Well, and they might qualify the shadow and unconscious impulses as the imposter, right? Imposter syndrome, which I think at that point, again, you're making an enemy out of the psyche.
Potential ally.
Yeah. It is. And I would say, again, even, yeah, it is you, and it's not you. It is you, but it's not the ego. It's not the ego.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And there are instances where the impulse that you might have, this, and it's always about what things that are dissociated and fragmented away. There are certain cases like OCD, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, is very challenging because it's like a part of the psyche gets somehow disconnected from the ego, and it just constantly bombarding the ego with this obsessive thoughts. And sometimes they can be very destructive thoughts, and they're very disturbing to the person who's suffering from this. And I mean, you can sometimes CBT that to death, and it doesn't get you anywhere. They still have the thought.
Yeah.
And the idea of let's just burn off the wood, that ain't going to cut it, sir. You can't do that. No. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Like, okay, you tell me how. Great. Sometimes those people need psychosurgery. It gets so intense.
Yeah.
I mean, and I guess you're literally doing it then, but.
Well, I would say saying that is and saying what has been said, especially within I would say not only just Peterson, but the pop psychology realm it is psychosurgery, but it's so psychologically unhygienic that it becomes infectious. And I was explaining in my video, but I don't think I explained it enough, and which is a lot of this information is out there, and clearly, given the conversation we've had, like there's something clearly wrong with conceptualizations, but not only that, being kind of just spread out into the market of what is now pop psychology. But it creates certain transferential relationships between the person viewing it and taking that information in, and then becoming reliant on the individual that's spewing it, that's really talking about it. Yeah. That's something that we really haven't dug into now, and maybe we do have another conversation about just transference in general. But you see it more and more now, and it's psychologically unhygienic.
The difference, I think, because transference can be healing. I mean, that's the whole point of therapy, is to use it and craft it into a healing relationship. But again, it's a weapon, it's a tool, it's a force, a power. And if you're not aware of it, if you don't have a handle on it consciously, ego-wise, then you're at its mercy. Right? So there's no problem I don't think any inherent wrongness to look at someone as an inspiring figure or teacher or whatever. I do that with Jung, but I don't think of him as a perfect guru who knew all things and, just dispensing wisdom from on high. He screwed things up. He garbled things sometimes. Nevertheless, especially when I first encountered Jung's writings, I did have a strong transference. Like, this guy, he's got the wisdom, man. He's, the man of personality. But he was smart enough to recognize the danger inherent in that. And once I came across his writings about man of personalities, which you brought up in your video, a great term, because it labels it. It says, there's the issue, right? Yeah. I'm projecting a lot onto that guy. Yeah. I need to be careful of that. It's not like I can completely stop it, right? Because part of it is the instinct. And again, what's the root of that? Again, we are social creatures. We have enormous brains. We are our sexual maturation is delayed deliberately. I mean, you've got most species can reproduce way earlier than humans can. So there's no reason why necessarily we would have to take so long, but we do. And there's a good evolutionary reason for that, because evolution says, I'm sure many different variations were tried, and the only ones left are the ones that take a long time, relatively speaking, to absorb the information that is needed so that you can not only have offspring, but they can have a high chance of survival. And in order to, we're a species that invests heavily in offspring. We're not like frogs, right? We don't just, have thousands of, and, may the best man win. One in 1,000 of them survive, right? That's one strategy some species use. We don't do that. We invest heavily in offspring, and it works. It works that's two different strategies that work in evolution. So, all right. So the point of it is that if it takes a long time, that means that there's going to be instincts in there that say, seek out the knowledgeable one in your environment, learn from that one. So that's where the senex kicks in, the mana personality, Messiah. That's where a lot of that stuff comes from, I think, because that's the kernel of those complexes form. Does that make sense? So as a child or even as a young adult, we'll take the example of hunting. So majority of our life as humans, we were hunters and gatherers. And the hunters, I don't know if you've ever tried to take down a mastodon with a pointed stick, but I'm guessing it's probably kind of difficult.
I've tried it a couple times.
Yeah. It's rough, right? It's rough. They don't like it. So, and so if you look at studies that explore traditional hunters using traditional methods that were used for maybe 100,000 years, it takes years to develop the kind of skill needed to be able to track the prey and all that sort of thing. This is one argument for why we live as long as we do, actually. It's called the grandfather hypothesis. I don't know if you've heard of this. But the point is that from this perspective, since it takes so long to effectively hunt and bring in food for the tribe, that we needed to, the genome had to be tweaked to where we could live long enough for that to be an effective strategy. And so that's apparently part of how it works. And you can see that in actual hunters, even though the peak hunters that bring in the most number of calories are around 30 years old, that's only one piece of the puzzle, because the hunters will traditionally go out in hunting parties, and there's a mixture of ages in those parties. And the old guys in the hunting party, they don't take down the game, but they know how to track the game and find out where they are, and they're experts at it. They're really good at it. And so what happens is there's this cooperative effort, and the young, strong guys, your age, right? They come in to the hunting party, and the old guys, they know where to go and find him. And of course, he's learning all this stuff because he's going to be an old guy one of these days, like me. But it's the young ones that come in and they throw the spear or whatever it is to take down the game. So there's this interplay. So what would develop in a situation like that? And we're talking generations and generations and generations.
Yeah.
If there's an instinct in there that says, find the old man who's wise, and he'll give you the gifts you need to survive, to win the prize, not only bring home the game, but of course that gets you prestige, and the women start getting real interested in you, and all that's the perfect recipe for a folktale. I don't know how many folktales are like that. You got the young guy, right? He goes out in the woods, he finds this weird old guy in the woods who gives him these gifts, and then he goes, comes back and wins the princess. Yeah. But the template for that, I think, is the hunting party. And the instinct behind that is, behind the senex energy is there. So all of us, male or female, once we get to a certain age, there's going to be a part of the genome that says, keep an eye open for that character in your environment who you can latch on, and the affect comes in. You can always tell that's the archetype, is when the affect pours in and you're like, man, this guy, he knows the stuff, right? So for me, that was Jung. right? And also my department chair, actually, when I was a resident, Jerry Kay, old Freudian, brilliant analyst. He didn't care much for Jung, but that's a whole other conversation. But I hung on every word that guy said, and it was pure gold to me, you know. But he could recognize that. I think he knew that that he was evoking that in me, you know. And so our interactions kind of had that dynamism to it. Only he was aware of it. I was learning to be aware of it, but he was aware. You know, he's more advanced guy, but. I don't know how we got off on the subject.
No, but that's he was aware of it. And I think like that.
Yeah, that was the point I was trying to make.
That's the danger of mana personalities, especially ones that, and this is a question that I would ask anybody who's in the public realm that makes these kind of broad, generalized recommendations for the population, right? Which is, are you aware of the potential transferential relationship there? And if you are you identifying it and saying, hey, listen, you need to live your life. You need to live a life for yourself.
Yeah.
Or what you're saying is you need to live this life, because if you don't, you're going to go to hell, right? Or something along those lines.
Something like that. Your life is going to be a mess.
And I like that, and I like that example you use of the kind of the hunters and the gatherers. I mean, those older men that knew exactly how to take down the beast, right? And bring it in, and knew where they were. I mean, that's years and years of experience, but they were also more than willing to kind of pass the torch and say, you are the next generation and you need to step up, right?
Absolutely.
You don't need to be me, but you need to be you and fulfill that. And I think that's
where do you think the puer comes from?
Right.
The puer comes from the fact that those old guys needed their own instincts.
Yeah.
The instincts don't just stop when you get to be an adult. They last your entire lifetime.
Exactly.
In fact, the important ones for your particular life, where you are in life, will emerge at the timing that it's needed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a natural thing that happens in all development of all biological organisms.
Yeah.
If you need to be sexually active now all of a sudden I'm really interested in the opposite sex.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It doesn't happen before that typically. Now, again, there's messiness and there's blurry boundaries here because we're dealing with biology, but in general speaking, that's how it works. So then those old guys, they needed to have an instinct too that says, let me mentor you. That'll help me feel better about myself, and I can pass on my knowledge, right? I'm getting to that stage myself in life where I want to this is what part of the channel is about, right? I want to share my knowledge, such as it is. You know, it may not be perfect. But the irony of what you were just saying a minute ago about how you need to live your life, this is the information I'm going to pass on to you, but you do with it what you will. The irony of that is it often gets lost.
Yeah.
The message look at the Buddha. He deliberately said, do not worship me. I am not a god.
Yeah.
Darn you people, what do they do?
Well, Jung, I mean, in Jung's work, I mean, he's like, memories, dreams, and reflections. They said, this is my personal myth. This is mine, right? It's not yours. It's mine. Live your life. And we said it earlier. I mean,
live your legend.
Yeah. Live your legend. But like, thank God I'm young and not a Jungian.
Yeah.
And I'm
an introverted response.
Right. I know this conversation's been highly critical of one individual in particular, and that is Jordan Peterson. And I think the reason that is that, to get back to the point that I just mentioned, is that if he knows about the transferential relationship that he's creating, if he was truly an analytical psychologist or a Jungian, he would know that. And the second part is, if he does know that and he's not bringing it up, where are his intentions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm inclined to think that he's not aware of it, but I don't know him, man.
Right, exactly. I don't know.
To him, I don't know.
But I did mention in the other video, I think that there are some truths in terms of his cultural commentary, and that, you know, I just think that there is so much more out there in terms of just this discussion that we've had, but also the work you've done, the work IPSA is doing, all of it. It's so much more life affirming, you know, instead of it being kind of a neurotic kind of polarity.
A neurotic response. You're always dealing with things that haven't been developed enough. If you run into that kind of rigid right? On the most rigid or the most primitive level, there's denial, right? I mean, it's not even there, you know. And then as you develop, something comes within, you get this black and white kind of characteristic to it. That's the flavor that it has.
Yeah.
You need to work it more. You need to mold it and craft it more to get to where you need to go. And yeah, so a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Well, just like the Maui and just like what was the other tribe? Maori. Perhaps the lesson there is that we can take away from it is to be the most adaptive that we can be.
Yeah.
And listen to the unconscious and pick up on the collective issues, the mass-mindedness that is happening around us, and make sure that we're living through our own legend and not somebody else's.
Yep. It's good advice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Dr. G, this was a great conversation as always.
All right. Well, we got to keep doing it.
We got to keep doing it. Yes, indeed. All right, sir. Well, you have a great week. We're recording again next week. That's going to be a fun conversation as well.
Look forward to it.
We'll keep it going.
All right.
All right, sir. Have a good one.
Great. Bye-bye.